It begins in the quiet, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a stillness so profound it seems to have weight, to press down through the ages. We are in a place where time is not measured by the clock on the wall, but by the slow decay of fired clay and the patient accumulation of dust in the grooves of a dead language. Here, in the low, warm light of an archive after hours, the air itself feels ancient. The scent is of dry earth, brittle paper, and the sterile cold of preservation. This is not a place for answers, but for the careful custody of questions. And one question, resting on a velvet cushion under a sheet of climate-controlled glass, is older and more demanding than all the others. It is a question that has waited for millennia, not to be solved, but to be properly read. Before us lies a fragment of the earth, turned to stone by human intention. It is a clay tablet, catalogued, numbered, and traced back to the plains of ancient Sumer. Its edges are chipped, its surface marred by a fine web of cracks, a testament to the fragility of memory. This object has survived the rise and fall of empires, the shifting of sands, the burning of libraries, and the slow, inexorable turning of the world. It is a piece of administrative debris from the very dawn of what we call civilization, a mundane artifact from a temple or a palace. Its purpose was simple: to record, to list, to remember. Yet, the memory it holds does not align with the history we have constructed for ourselves. It feels less like a foundation stone and more like the last surviving page from a library we never knew existed. The marks upon its face are precise, deliberate. This is cuneiform, one of the first true scripts. Each wedge-shaped impression was pressed into wet clay by a steady hand, the work of a scribe whose name is lost to us, but whose discipline is perfectly preserved. The text is arranged in neat columns, a testament to an orderly mind, a society obsessed with structure and accounting. It reads like a ledger, a registry of assets, a transfer of authority. There is no poetry here, no grand mythology in the style of its telling. The language is bureaucratic, repetitive, and cold. It is the language of a system already in motion, of a world that is being managed, not created. The scribe was not a storyteller inventing a past. He was an archivist documenting a chain of custody. And that is where the stillness is first disturbed. The document, known to scholars as the Sumerian King List, purports to be a simple record of succession, a linear accounting of the rulers who held power over the land. It begins with a formal, almost legalistic statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This is the starting point, the designated origin. From this single declarative sentence, the list unfolds, king by king, city by city, reign by reign. It is a foundational document, intended to establish legitimacy and historical continuity. It is meant to be the first chapter, the formal beginning of order and rule. But the scribe's meticulous record-keeping soon deviates from the expected path, leading not to clarity, but to a profound and unsettling chronological abyss. The first king named is Alulim. The scribe notes his reign with the same dispassionate precision as all the others. The entry is not embellished or highlighted. It is simply data. Alulim, it states, ruled for 800 years. The next king, Alalngar, ruled for 36,000 years. Two kings, a total of 8 Ursars, or 800 years, in a single city before the kingship was moved to another. The numbers are presented without commentary, without explanation. They are listed with the same administrative sobriety as a tally of grain sacks or a census of livestock. The scribe's stylus makes no distinction between a reign of 28 years and one of 28,000. It is all just part of the official record, a single unbroken sequence of governance that begins long before any known timeline of human civilization. A silence falls between the object and the observer. The mind attempts to reconcile the sheer impossibility of the numbers with the mundane reality of the artifact that contains them. A reign of 36 years is not history. It is not even myth. It is a category of time that we have no framework to understand. And yet, it is recorded on a physical object, in a real language, by a person whose job was to keep accurate records for the state. The tablet does not present this as allegory, it presents it as data. The cold, hard clay under the soft light of the archive refuses to yield. It offers no apology for its contents. It simply is. The contradiction is so profound that it destabilizes the very ground upon which our history is built. We must look closer at the hand that made these marks. The uniformity of the script is the key. The scribe does not use a different style or a different format for these primordial kings. He does not employ a separate section for mythical time before transitioning to real time. The long-reigning kings are followed, in the very same list and with the same formulaic language, by kings whose reigns are historically plausible, some of whom have been verified through archaeological evidence. The transition is seamless. The document breathes a single, consistent logic from beginning to end. The scribe saw Alulim's 800 years, and a later king's 25 years, as part of the same continuous, factual history. The problem, then, is not that the scribe was telling a story, but that he seemingly believed he was not. Herein lies the true anomaly. This is not a failure of reason on the part of the ancients, but perhaps a failure of context on our part. The Sumerian king list does not ask us to believe in men who lived for millennia. It asks us to confront a system of record-keeping that treated the impossible as administrative fact. Why would a civilization, at the very moment it is inventing bureaucracy and formal history, create a foundational document that blends verifiable data with chronological absurdities? It is a question that undermines the very purpose of the record itself. It suggests that this list was not a history of a new world being born, but an attempt to reconstruct the memory of an old one that had been lost, a world that operated under entirely different rules. The single tablet in its glass case is not alone. It is a survivor, one of thousands dredged from the dust. In the deep storage of this archive, and in others like it across the world, rows upon rows of silent tablets wait. Each one is a frozen moment of thought, a fragment of a lost consciousness. They speak of laws, of star charts, of medical procedures, of receipts for goats. They are the granular data of a functioning world, but taken together, they do not tell a story of a simple, linear beginning. They hint at a knowledge and a timeline that seem to come from nowhere, fully formed. The king list is merely the most obvious crack in the accepted narrative. The first thread that, when pulled, threatens to unravel the entire tapestry. It is a strange and unsettling place to begin a story, with a document that seems to chronicle an ending. The conventional narrative of history starts here, with the first cities and the first words. But the words themselves speak of a time before. They point backwards into a deep and unrecorded chasm of time, across which only these impossible numbers and king names seem to have survived. This is not the dawn, but a remembrance of a dawn that has already passed. And for those who are willing to remain here in the quiet, to look past the accepted explanation, and listen to the silence of the object itself, the real investigation has only just begun. We return to the list, to the cold, hard clay. The scribe's work continues beyond the first kings of Eridu. The document states, with unblinking clarity, that after Al-Alangar, the kingship was moved. It traveled to the city of Bad Tibira. There, 3 more kings are recorded. The first, Enmenlu-Ana, is said to have reigned for 200 years. The next, Enmengal-Ana, for 800 years. And the third, Dumuzid, the shepherd, held the throne for 36 Audozerun years. The scribe's stylus moves with the same rhythm, the same pressure for each entry. The numbers, which should shatter any sense of historical reality, are treated as simple administrative inputs. They are not highlighted, They are not questioned. They are merely the next line in the ledger of the world, recorded for posterity with the same dispassion as a tax receipt. The sequence is relentless in its precision. After the reign of Dumuzid, the kingship is transferred again, this time to the city of Larak. One king ruled there, Ensipad Zid Ana. His tenure is listed as 800 years. Then a transfer to Sipar, where another king, Enmendur Ana, ruled for 0 years. Finally, the kingship moved to Shurupak. Its last king before the Great Rupture, Ubara Tutu, is credited with a reign of 600 years. The scribe then pauses, his work on this section complete. He has listed 8 kings in 5 cities. A simple summation of the reigns he has so meticulously recorded yields a total of 200 years. This is the duration of the first chapter of governance on Earth, as documented by its earliest accountants. The number sits there on the tablet, a silent monument to a scale of time we cannot process, yet recorded by a civilization obsessed with order. We must visualize the hand that made these marks. A man, sitting in the low light of a reed-lit room, the air thick with the smell of wet clay and dust. His tools are simple: a stylus of sharpened reed, a tablet of damp earth. His task is not one of creation, but of transcription. He is likely copying from an older tablet, a master list passed down through generations of scribal schools. His focus is on accuracy, on the perfect replication of each wedge, each number, each name. There is no room for personal interpretation. The formula is rigid: king's name, city, duration of rule. His movements are repetitive, disciplined, almost mechanical. He is not a poet wrestling with a metaphor. He is an archivist ensuring the integrity of a database. The sheer impossibility of the data he is transcribing seems not to concern him. His duty is to the record, and the record is absolute. This first section of the list, this antediluvian history, is presented as a closed and complete account. It has a beginning, a middle, and a definitive end. The scribe does not leave the transition to chance or interpretation. After the final entry for Ubara Tutu of Shurupak, he makes a simple, declarative statement that serves as a final entry for an entire epoch. He writes, "Then the flood swept over." The line is not dramatic. It is not an epic poem. It is an administrative note, a concluding remark at the end of a long and detailed report. It functions as a dividing line, a full stop. It is the formal closure of one world's accounting period before the opening of the next. The greatest cataclysm in memory is reduced to 4 words that serve to separate one king list from another. After this stark entry, a space is left on the tablet. It is a deliberate pause, a visual representation of the silence that followed the event. Then the text resumes, with the exact same formula as before. The scribe writes, "After the flood had swept over, when the kingship was lowered again from heaven, the kingship was in Kish." The system reboots. The process of governance, of record-keeping, begins anew. The chain of custody is re-established, and the scribe is there to document it. The transition is seamless, suggesting that for the authors of this document, the flood was not a myth, but a historical event that necessitated a new chapter in the great ledger of civilization. It was an interruption of the system, not the end of it. The memory of the previous order was the blueprint for the new one. The kings who rule from Kish after the flood are different. Their reigns, while still impossibly long by our standards, are significantly shorter than those of their antediluvian predecessors. The first king of the new dynasty, Jushur, is said to have ruled for 200 years. His successor, Kulasina Bel, for 960 years. The numbers slowly, almost systematically, begin to decrease as the list progresses through subsequent dynasties in cities like Uruk and Ur. It is a slow, methodical deflation of time, a gradual descent from a forgotten chronological scale into one that approaches our own. The scribe records this change without comment. He is simply documenting the data as it was given to him, reign by reign, number by number, as the world settles into a new and diminished rhythm. The most unsettling aspect of the entire document is this internal consistency. The scribe does not employ a different mythological language for the early kings and a historical one for the later kings. The very same cuneiform signs and grammatical structures are used to describe Alulim's 800-year reign, and much later in the same list, the 23-year reign of a verifiable historical figure like Gilgamesh of Uruk. The document breathes a single unified logic from start to finish. It presents a continuous, unbroken history, interrupted only by a single, catastrophic administrative event. The scribe saw no contradiction. He was preserving a single, coherent timeline. The problem is not that his record is inconsistent. The problem is that its consistency points to a history we are unable to accept. This obsession with lists, with the cold cataloging of the world, was not confined to the lineage of kings. In the archives of Nippur, of Uruk, of Lagash, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of other tablets that reveal the same administrative mindset. These are the so-called lexical lists, and they are among the oldest written documents in existence. They are not narratives or hymns. They are simply lists. Lists of professions, from king to stonecutter. Lists of different kinds of trees. Lists of animals, domestic and wild. Lists of cities, of gods, of body parts, of wooden objects, of metal tools. They are the raw, structured data of the Sumerian world, an attempt to classify and organize every single component of their reality. They are the world's first encyclopedias. These lists do not read like the work of a civilization slowly discovering its world. They read like an inventory of a world already known. They appear in the archaeological record almost fully formed, without a long, clumsy period of development. The earliest examples, dating back to the late 4th millennium BCE, already display a sophisticated system of categorization. Scribes were not creating these categories, they were learning them. The lists were standardized, copied, and passed down through generations as the foundation of all education. To be a scribe was to memorize the great catalogs of what is. This suggests a knowledge that was not being built, but being preserved. It was a curriculum inherited from a prior source, a complete data set of a world that needed to be remembered correctly. This pattern of inherited, complete systems extends beyond the classification of the physical world. It reaches toward the heavens. Among the administrative records are tablets that contain sophisticated astronomical data. They are not poetic descriptions of the stars, but tables of celestial movements, records of planetary positions, calculations of lunar cycles. They are the detached empirical observations of a people who watched the sky with a purpose that went beyond simple agriculture or navigation. They were tracking the great slow cycles of cosmic time, and they were doing so with a mathematical precision that seems profoundly out of place for the dawn of civilization. They were not just watching the sky, they were measuring its machinery. For a moment, in the quiet of this place, simply note the time. Register it. The act of marking the present is an ancient one. What is being registered here is not just a number on a clock, but a shared moment of witness. This act of observation, of noting a specific point in time, connects us directly to the work of the scribe. He too was a registrar of moments, of cycles, of durations. He marked the passage of a king, the rising of a planet, the turning of an age. By pausing to mark our own present, we participate in this same ancient ritual of record-keeping, acknowledging the passage of time that both separates us from and connects us to these first archivists of history. Within these astronomical texts lies a number that is difficult to explain. The records demonstrate an awareness of the precession of the equinoxes, the slow 920-year wobble of the Earth's axis as it spins. This is a cycle so vast, so slow, that it is imperceptible within a single human lifetime. Discovering it requires continuous, meticulous observation recorded and passed down over many centuries, if not millennia. Yet, knowledge of this great year is embedded in the myths, the mathematics, and the calendars of the earliest known civilizations. It appears not as a late discovery, but as a foundational principle of their cosmic system. It is another piece of knowledge that seems to have no clear point of origin, no developmental history. It simply is, present from the beginning. The presence of this knowledge forces a difficult question. How does a civilization, supposedly taking its first steps out of the Stone Age, possess a data point that requires a timescale of observation longer than its own recorded existence? There are two possibilities. Either they developed this knowledge themselves through some unknown and accelerated means, or it was part of a legacy, a surviving fragment of a much older body of scientific work. The scribe, recording his tables of planetary motion, does not offer an answer. He is, as always, merely concerned with the accuracy of the data. He records the cycles as he was taught them, just as he recorded the kings. The source of the information is not his concern. Its preservation is. We are left to confront the nature of the scribe himself, not as a person, but as a function. He is the human interface for a system of knowledge. His role was to be a custodian of information, to ensure its transmission without corruption. The world he inhabited was one defined by lists, by categories, by cycles, and by numbers. The reign of a king lasting 36 years, the name of a distant star, the classification of a specific type of stone, and the duration of a cosmic cycle were not different kinds of information to him. They were all data points to be entered into the great inventory of reality. His world was not one of myth and history, but of record and administration. And so, the picture that emerges from these earliest records is not one of a fledgling humanity crafting stories to explain a frightening world. It is the picture of a successor culture, a society of survivors, obsessively documenting and cataloging the knowledge of a world that has passed. They are not inventing their history. They are taking dictation. The cold, repetitive, and administrative tone of these thousands of tablets is perhaps the most significant clue we have. It speaks not of creativity, but of a desperate and meticulous effort to reconstruct a system, to rebuild a library from its last surviving pages before they, too, turn to dust. The sheer volume of this data is staggering. It is not one strange list, but a whole architecture of improbable knowledge. From the reigns of kings that defy biology, to biological classifications that defy their supposed timeline, to astronomical calculations that defy their historical context. Each tablet, taken alone, can be dismissed as myth, as metaphor, as scribal error. But when viewed together, laid out in the silent rows of an archive, they cease to be anomalies. They become a pattern. They are the consistent, cross-referenced output of a single, coherent, and deeply strange system of thought. A system whose origins are nowhere to be found. We are left in this room, surrounded by the silent testimony of the scribes. Each tablet is a data point, a frozen calculation from a forgotten age. The initial shock of the impossible numbers on the king list begins to fade, replaced by a much deeper and more pervasive sense of unease. The anomaly is not the content of any single record. The anomaly is the record-keeping system itself. It is a system that appears fully formed, possessing a map of the world and the cosmos that it should not have. The question is no longer, did these kings live for 800 years? The question has become, what was the source of the data that these first scribes were tasked to preserve? The answer is not on the tablets. Only the data remains. The question that hangs in the air of the archive is one of isolation. Is this single tablet, with its impossible numbers, a unique anomaly? A piece of localized folklore? A scribal tradition confined to the sun-baked plains between two rivers? Or is it a single surviving data point from a much larger and more widespread system of memory? To answer that, we must leave the silence of this room and travel. We must move from the dust of Mesopotamia to the black, fertile soil of another river valley, where another great civilization was stirring, seemingly in parallel. We must go to the land of the Nile, where the work of the scribe was not done on clay, but on stone and papyrus, and see what records were kept there. The hands of the researcher move with a practiced slowness, brushing away the fine sand that has accumulated over 3,000 years. The work is not one of dramatic discovery, but of patient, incremental revelation. Here, in the ruins of a temple library or a royal tomb, the light is different. The air carries a different scent, but the task is the same. It is the recovery of a frozen thought, an attempt to read the administrative mind of a world long gone. The object of this attention is not a tablet, but a fragment of hard black diorite, its surface covered in a grid of meticulously carved hieroglyphs. It is a piece of a much larger monument, a shard of an official state record, shattered and scattered by the forces of time. This artifact, known as the Palermo Stone, is an administrative document of the highest order. It is a royal annal, a year-by-year accounting of the reigns of the earliest kings of Egypt. Like its Sumerian counterpart, it is not a narrative. It is a list. It records the name of the king, the important religious festivals of each year, and, most critically, the height of the annual Nile inundation, measured down to the palm and finger. It is a document obsessed with precision, with the cold, hard data of governance and survival. But as the researcher traces the columns of text back to their beginning, back before the reign of the first historical pharaoh, the list enters a different kind of time. It records a lineage of pre-dynastic kings who ruled over Upper and Lower Egypt before they were unified, kings for whom we have no other archaeological record. And the Palermo Stone is not alone. In an archive in Turin, Italy, rests another, more fragile record, a papyrus so brittle it threatens to disintegrate into dust. The Turin King Papyrus, pieced together from dozens of fragments, confirms the pattern. It too is a list of kings, and it too begins not with the first mortal ruler, Menes, but with a long succession of divine and semi-divine rulers. It lists the reigns of the gods, beginning with Ptah, Ra, and Geb, followed by a collective of beings known as the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus. According to the scribe's own calculations, these preceding dynasties of gods and spirits ruled for a period totaling over 23 Orson years before the first human pharaoh took the throne. The numbers are different, but the structure of the timeline is hauntingly familiar. Here, a silence must be observed. Two distinct civilizations, separated by 1,000 miles of harsh desert, each emerging into the light of written history at roughly the same moment in time. Both are driven by the same impulse, to create a foundational document of their own history. And both of these foundational documents follow the exact same inexplicable template. They begin by establishing a chain of custody that stretches back into a deep mythological time, chronicling the reigns of gods or spirits who ruled for thousands of years. Only after this impossibly long prelude do they transition seamlessly into the reigns of their own documented mortal kings. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. We must imagine the quiet halls of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the low hum of the climate control preserving these fragile memories. We see the stone fragment under its glass case, the papyrus in its climate-controlled frame. They are artifacts of a different culture, written in a different language, born of a different landscape. Yet they tell the same structural story as the clay tablet from Sumer. They are the work of scribes who believed their history did not start with them, but that they were the inheritors of a much older and more profound legacy of order, a system of governance passed down from a prior age. The repetition of this idea across cultures is where the investigation truly begins to deepen. To remain in this quiet is to accept that some patterns are not meant to be solved quickly. They are meant to be held in view, over a long watch, shared by those who are not looking for an answer, but for the shape of the original question. It is an act of intellectual stillness, a commitment to observing the evidence as it is, without the immediate need to explain it away. For those who continue this vigil, the pattern only grows stronger. Its echoes found in the most unexpected corners of the ancient world, recorded by those who came much later, but who had access to archives we have lost. Consider the work of the later chroniclers, men who stood at the closing of the ancient world and tried to compile its history. In the 3rd century BCE, the Egyptian priest Manetho, with access to temple libraries that had stood for millennia, wrote his history of Egypt. Though his work survives only in fragments quoted by others, its structure is clear. It begins with the rule of gods, followed by demigods, and only then the line of mortal pharaohs, beginning with Menes. In Babylon, at the same time, the priest Berossus wrote a history of his own people. His work, too, began with a list of 10 antediluvian kings who ruled for a total of 432 years before a great flood destroyed everything. The pattern is not just ancient. It was a memory that was being actively preserved. The archaeologist in his trench provides the physical counterpoint to these textual records. His trowel scrapes against something hard. He brushes the soil away. He is not looking at a text, but at the earth itself. The wall of the trench is a book written in layers of soil. He can see the strata of a settlement, compacted earth from mud brick walls, layers of ash from ancient hearths, broken pottery. And then he sees it, a thick, clean, uniform layer of silt, containing no artifacts, no signs of life. It is a sterile line, a geological full stop. And below it, the layers of occupation begin again, but the style of the pottery is different. The building techniques have changed. There was a break, a profound physical interruption in the life of the city. This is the moment where two forms of evidence converge. The scribe, in his distant past, writes a clinical note. Then the flood swept over. The archaeologist, in our present, points to the physical trace of that event in the earth. The Egyptian lists use the unification of the two lands under the first pharaoh as their own administrative year zero, the beginning of a new historical age. In both cases, the textual record and the geological or archaeological record point to the same conclusion. The civilization we are studying is not a continuous, linear development. It is a post-cataclysmic phenomenon. It is the world that came after a profound and disruptive ending. The scribes were not just telling a story, they were documenting the restart. What is most striking is the administrative tone that persists across these cultures when documenting this rupture. There is no epic lament for the world that was lost. The Sumerian scribe does not describe the terror of the floodwaters. The Egyptian annalist does not compose a poem about the chaos that preceded the first king. The event is treated as a known fact, a historical marker that requires no emotional elaboration. It is the line item that closes one ledger and opens another. This lack of emotion is chilling. It suggests a trauma so complete that it has passed beyond the realm of memory and into the realm of pure procedural fact. It was the event that reset the clock of the world. We see the researcher's hands again, this time in a laboratory. On one side of a long table he has arranged pottery shards from below the silt layer. They are finely made, with complex, geometric patterns painted in multiple colors. On the other side are shards from the layers above the silt. They are thicker, simpler, with crude, incised decorations. A skill was lost in the interim. A technology, a tradition, an aesthetic sensibility. It was washed away. The physical objects themselves bear silent witness to the gap, to the forgetting. The world after the rupture was a simpler, cruder place. It was a world that had to begin again, armed with only the fragmented memories of what had come before. This shared pattern extends beyond the chronicles of kings and cataclysms. It is embedded in the very foundation of knowledge itself. The Sumerian obsession with lexical lists, the endless cataloging of all things in the known world, finds its parallel in Egypt. The earliest scribal schools on the Nile also used standardized lists as their primary educational tools. Lists of professions, of geographical locations, of different kinds of birds, of sacred objects. It is the same intellectual impulse, the same administrative mindset. It is the behavior of a culture that believes the world is a known quantity, a data set to be memorized and preserved, not a new frontier to be explored and discovered. Why this shared methodology? Why would two independent cultures, when inventing the very concept of writing and statehood, both decide that the most important task was not to create new stories, but to meticulously catalog the components of a pre-existing world? It suggests that they were not working from a blank slate. They were working from the surviving fragments of a much older, more comprehensive system of knowledge. Their work was not one of invention, but of reconstruction. They were the archivists of a lost civilization, tasked with rebuilding the great library of the world from its last few scattered and water-damaged pages. A wind blows across the desolate mounds that mark the location of ancient Uruk, carrying with it the dust of millennia. That same wind, traveling west, stirs the sands around the weathered stones of the Saqqara necropolis. The distance between these 2 points is vast, a chasm of geography and time. For most of history, they were separate worlds. Yet, in the deepest and oldest layers of their recorded thought, they seem to be working from a common blueprint. They share a memory of a time before their time, a history of divine rulers and impossible timelines, and a record of a great rupture that reset the world and began their own. In the fading light of the desert, the archaeologist packs his tools. His notebook is filled with measurements, with sketches of strata, with catalog numbers for the artifacts he has unearthed. His work is a mirror of the ancient scribes. He is collecting disparate data points, a piece of clay, a layer of soil, a fragment of stone, and attempting to arrange them into a coherent sequence, a story. But the story his data tells is one of a profound discontinuity. It speaks of a world that did not simply begin, but which was violently interrupted and then painstakingly rebooted. He is not just digging up the past, he is rediscovering the evidence of its erasure. The pattern is no longer a simple anomaly confined to a single clay tablet. It has become a structural signature, a foundational principle shared by the great, originating civilizations of the ancient Near East. They did not see themselves as the dawn of history. They saw themselves as the survivors of a previous history, the custodians of a fragile memory. Their first and most sacred task was to write down what they remembered of the world that had been lost, to create a permanent record of the order that had preceded the chaos. Their chronicles are not creation myths. They are disaster recovery plans, and so the lens must widen again. We have moved from a single tablet in Sumer to a corresponding set of records in Egypt. We have seen the same pattern repeated in the textual fragments of later chroniclers and reflected in the physical layers of the earth. The initial question is no longer sufficient. It is not enough to ask what these records mean. We must now ask how far this pattern extends. If this shared memory exists in the 2 great river valleys of the ancient world, where else might we find its echoes? The investigation has moved beyond a single culture. It must now begin to scan the entire horizon of the ancient world, searching for other, more distant reflections of this same impossible beginning. We must return to the first line of the record, the foundational statement that precedes all history. After the kingship descended from heaven. The phrase has always been read as poetry, as a metaphor for the divine right to rule. But the scribe who wrote it was not a poet. He was an accountant. In the cold administrative language of his world, this was not a mythic statement, but a procedural one. It reads like the first line of a legal transfer document, a formal acknowledgement of a change in custody. It suggests that governance was not an idea invented by humanity, but an existing system, an apparatus of control, that was formally handed over. It implies a preceding authority, a prior administration whose work was now being delegated. The history of human rule, from its very first recorded moment, begins with the memory of a handover. The record does not leave the identity of this prior authority to the imagination. It lists them. Before the flood, before the first mortal king of Kish, there were these other rulers. Alulim, who established the kingship in Eridu. Enmenlu-Ana, who governed from Bad Tibira. These are the antediluvian kings. The scribe records their names and their impossibly long tenures with the same dispassionate precision as he records a shipment of barley. He does not call them gods, but he assigns them functions that are foundational. They are the ones who established the first cities, who organized the first territories. Their reigns, stretching across millennia, are presented not as a biological miracle, but as a measure of an era, a period of profound and unbroken stability under a single, consistent form of governance. They are the original board of directors. A researcher sits in the low light, the tablet before him. His finger traces the wedge-shaped signs for a name, then the signs for a number. There is no change in the scribe's hand. The pressure of the stylus is the same. The spacing of the characters is uniform. The entry for a king who ruled for 200 years is physically indistinguishable from the entry for a king who ruled for 23. This uniformity is the most unsettling detail. It is a silence in the record, a lack of any signal that we are crossing a boundary from the real to the symbolic. For the archivist of ancient Sumer, these beings were not myths. They were simply the previous entry in the same continuous ledger of the world. They were the names on the accounts from the fiscal year before the Great Crash. In other texts from the same period, we find a collective name for this ruling class, the Anunnaki. This word is not presented with a halo of divine light. It appears in legal codes, in astronomical tables, in architectural plans. Their function is consistently described in administrative terms. They are the ones who came down from heaven. They are the ones who measured the land, who assigned the tasks, who established the prototypes for the first cities. The texts describe them not as objects of abstract worship, but as a council, a committee of founders who made decisions and gave directives. They are the source of the initial blueprint. The language used is that of a legislative body, not a pantheon. They decree fates, they set boundaries, they establish order. Consider the figure of Enki, one of the primary figures in this group. The tablets do not describe him through miracles or abstract powers. They describe him through his work. He is depicted as a master craftsman, a chief engineer. He is the one who organizes the world, who purifies the rivers, who fills them with fish. He establishes the patterns for agriculture. He creates the brick mold. He lays the foundations of the first temples. This is not the language of myth. It is the language of a project manager's report. Each act is a logistical accomplishment, a problem solved, a system implemented. The creation of civilization is portrayed as a vast and complex engineering project, and these beings were the engineers, the surveyors, and the technicians in charge of its execution. The implication of this cold, functional language is profound. It suggests that the dawn of civilization was not a slow, organic process of human trial and error. It was a planned event, a deliberate implementation of a pre-existing package of technology and social organization. The others were not gods to be worshipped for their mysterious power, but administrators to be obeyed for their superior knowledge and authority. They were the instructors, and humanity was the recipient of a complex and comprehensive curriculum. The scribe, in his quiet room, is not inventing a mythology to explain the world. He is transcribing the memory of the world's founding charter and its original signatories. His work is that of a clerk, preserving the founding documents of the entire enterprise. This pattern is not confined to the dust of Mesopotamia. We travel to the banks of the Nile, to the fragmented remains of the Turin king papyrus. Here, too, the scribe begins his great list of rulers not with the first human pharaoh, but with a preceding line of governors. The list starts with a dynasty of gods, followed by a mysterious collective known as the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus. These beings are not described as ethereal spirits. They are listed as kings, each with their own reign, who governed the land for thousands of years before the first mortal dynasty was established. They are the bridge, the transitional authority between the divine originators and the human successors. The structure of the memory is identical, a pre-human administration that established the system. A quiet moment must be taken to absorb the weight of this repetition. Two of the world's oldest, most influential civilizations, supposedly developing in isolation from one another, both chose to anchor their official histories in the same unbelievable premise. They both insist that their own story is the second chapter, and that the first was written and directed by a non-human order of beings whose role was purely functional. They were the ones who set the stage, who established the rules, and who then handed over the administration. This is not a shared myth. It is a shared administrative memory, a common structural echo from a time before the records began. The dust in the air of this archive seems to carry the same story as the dust in a Theban tomb. Returning to the Sumerian record, we find another category of these beings, another job title in the great hierarchy. These are the Apkallu, the 7 sages who are said to have lived before the Great Flood. The texts are explicit about their function. They were not kings, and they were not gods of creation. They were teachers. They are credited with bringing to humanity the foundational elements of civilization, what the texts call the Me, the universal decrees of divine law. They brought writing, mathematics, architecture, law, and medicine. They are described as the advisors to the antediluvian kings, the bearers of the original knowledge. Their role was purely didactic. They were the instructors sent to implement the curriculum. The existence of these Apkallu provides a context for the strange, encyclopedic nature of the earliest scribal texts. The lexical lists, those endless catalogues of every object, animal, and profession in the world, suddenly appear in a different light. The scribal tradition itself held that these lists were not compiled by humans, but were taught to them by these ancient sages. The task of the first scribes was not to discover and classify the world, but to perfectly memorize and replicate the classification system they had been given. Education, at its very root, was the act of preserving an inherited data set. The scribe was not an explorer of knowledge. He was its curator, its human hard drive. This reframes the entire narrative of human intellectual development. The great leap forward that occurred around 6,000 years ago was not, perhaps, a cognitive revolution from within. It was an information transfer from without. The others were not just rulers. They were the source of the operating system. They provided the software, the laws, the sciences, the social structures that allowed complex urban civilization to boot up with such astonishing speed. The first cities were not the result of a slow evolution, but the result of implementing a known and effective design. The work of the scribe was to ensure that this software was not corrupted, that the original code was preserved for all future generations. The distinction we make between king, god, and sage begins to dissolve when viewed through this administrative lens. They are not separate categories of being, but different roles within a single, complex hierarchy. The Anunnaki are the board of directors. The antediluvian kings are the regional governors. The Apkallu are the technical specialists and trainers. The texts do not treat them as fundamentally different kinds of entities. They are all part of the same command structure, their actions recorded in the same dispassionate functional language. A tablet might list the decree of a king on one line, and the technical specifications for a temple, as dictated by a sage, on the next. It is all just the business of the day. Look at the specific titles these beings are given in the earliest texts. They are not grand, poetic epithets. They are job descriptions. Enlil is the lord of the command. Ninurta is the lord of the plow. Shai, the chief of agriculture. In Egypt, the god Thoth is not just the god of wisdom. He is the scribe of the gods, the chief record keeper. Ptah is the master builder. These are not titles meant to inspire awe. They are titles that denote a specific function, a tangible responsibility within the larger organization. They speak of a world that was not just ruled, but meticulously managed, with every aspect of its operation assigned to a specific department head. The most profound evidence for this functional reality is the complete absence of personal narrative or emotional color in the earliest records. The scribe does not describe what it felt like to be in the presence of an Apkallu. He does not write a hymn praising the glorious appearance of an Anunnaki. He simply records their directives, their accomplishments, their transfers of power. The texts are chillingly neutral. They are the minutes of a meeting, not the gospels of a new religion. The sheer, overwhelming strangeness of these non-human entities is completely normalized by the bureaucratic language used to describe them. They were simply a fact of the world, the management that was in place before the current management took over. This functional, almost corporate structure of the others forces a radical rereading of what we call mythology. Perhaps the stories of the gods that have come down to us are not primitive attempts to explain nature, but the degraded, fragmented, and misunderstood memories of a real historical power structure. The temple was not originally a place of worship, but a center of administration, a repository of knowledge, and a hub for the distribution of technology and resources. The great religious festivals were not just acts of piety, but perhaps the ritualized reenactments of forgotten administrative procedures, a cargo cult of governance whose original meaning had been lost after the rupture. The pattern is coherent and deeply unsettling. Across the foundational cultures of the ancient world, the memory of the others is not one of divine mystery, but of a structured, hierarchical, and functional administration. They are remembered for their work, as legislators, as engineers, as teachers, as the authors of the civilizational code. Their divinity is a later interpretation, a gloss applied by generations who had forgotten the original, practical context. They were the system administrators of the world before the Great Crash. And this realization opens a final, more disturbing line of inquiry. If they were the managers, what was the project? And what does it mean that their work was so catastrophically interrupted? The administrative record is precise. It details the functions of the others, their decrees, their projects, their designated roles within a vast and orderly enterprise. But the most important piece of administrative data they left behind is not a number or a name. It is a silence, a sudden, profound, and all-encompassing cessation of the record. One moment, the system is operational, meticulously documented by its designated managers. The next, the managers are gone. The texts that follow are not a continuation, but an echo, a memory of a system that has already ceased to be. The history we can read is defined by the history that was abruptly terminated. The presence of the others is felt most powerfully in their absolute and final absence from the ledger. This silence extends backward as well as forward. The entire apparatus of civilization, the laws, the agriculture, the writing, the urban design, appears in the archaeological record with a shocking abruptness. There is no long, slow, clumsy period of trial and error. There are no primitive drafts of the system. The record does not show a civilization learning to walk. It shows one that has been taught to run, and is now trying to remember the instructions. The true void is the period just before the first words were written. It is a gap not of millennia, but of developmental logic. What should be the long and messy first chapter of the story is simply not there. The book of our history opens on page 100, with a footnote mentioning that all preceding pages have been lost. The archaeologist's trowel gives this silence a physical form. In the trenches dug into the great mounds of ancient cities, there is often a line. It is a layer of clean, uniform silt, sometimes meters thick, containing no pottery, no tools, no bones, no ash from a hearth. It is a sterile band of earth, a geological scar. Below it lies the evidence of one world, one kind of settlement. Above it, after the gap, lies another, different in its tools and its architecture. This sterile layer is not just an absence of data, it is the data itself. It is the physical signature of the invisible antagonist, a quiet, suffocating blanket of mud and water that pressed down upon the world and stopped its history, wiping the slate so clean that even the memory of the writing was almost lost. This sense of a broken record is not metaphorical, it is literal. The Sumerian king list, the foundational document we have been examining, does not exist as a single perfect object. It is a scholarly reconstruction, a fragile mosaic pieced together from more than 15 different and often contradictory fragments. These are the shards of a memory, tablets broken and scattered across the ruins of a dozen cities. We hold in our hands the debris of the original archive. The antagonist is the force that shattered the master copy, that snapped the spine of the world's first history book. We are left to guess at the words that were written on the pieces that were never found, the names and numbers that were ground back into the dust. Imagine the great libraries of the ancient world. Not just Alexandria, but the archives of Nineveh, of Hattusa, of Pergamum. These were not mere collections of scrolls. They were the central processing units of entire empires, repositories of science, law, and history stretching back to the beginning. Their destruction by fire and conquest was not just an act of war. It was an act of targeted memory erasure. The smoke that rose from those burning halls was the physical manifestation of the antagonist's work. Each scroll that turned to ash, each tablet that cracked in the heat, was a neuron firing for the last time in the collective mind of the ancient world. The silence that followed was not an accident of time. It was a strategic objective, successfully achieved. The antagonist works on the smallest of scales as well. Within the cuneiform texts that survive, there are words that remain phantoms. We can transcribe the signs, we can understand the grammar of the sentence, but the meaning of a key noun or verb is lost. It has no known root, no clear context that would unlock its definition. Often, these ghost words appear in descriptions of the others, their tools, or their activities. They are locked black boxes in the middle of a sentence, their contents inaccessible. The passage of time has not just faded the ink, it has erased the concepts themselves. The antagonist is a force of semantic decay, ensuring that even the surviving records will keep some of their deepest secrets forever. We must pause here. The weight of this absence is a physical thing. It can be felt in the cool, still air of the archive. It is the silence between the shelves, the space between the catalogued fragments. To truly understand this story, one must learn to read the gaps, the unwritten pages, the missing years, the untranslatable words. This is where the real narrative resides. It is a history told in negative space, a portrait of a world defined by what it has lost. The work is not to fill these voids with speculation, but to recognize their shape, to measure their depth, to acknowledge that the silence itself is the primary artifact. It is the one thing that has been preserved in its entirety. In this quiet, take a moment. Notice the space between your own thoughts, the interval between the sounds you hear. Register that brief void. It is a small, personal echo of the great silence we are observing. For those who wish to join this vigil, take a moment to measure that interval. In the comments below, simply write the word "measured" and the time on your clock. It is an ancient scribal practice, to give a name to the void, to mark the duration of the gap. It is an act of witnessing not what is there, but what is not. It is a way of acknowledging the presence of the antagonist, The disappearance is not just of records, but of personnel. The Apkallu, those 7 sages who brought the arts of civilization to the antediluvian kings, are a case in point. The texts are clear. They were present before the flood, as teachers and advisors. After the flood, they are mentioned only as figures of the distant past. They are gone. The new world, the world of the restart, had to make do without its original instructors. This is a profound and specific absence. Imagine a world that has been given a library of advanced textbooks, but the professors who wrote them have all vanished. Humanity was left alone with the curriculum, struggling to interpret the notes of a lesson it had only half understood. The consequences of this departure are written in the earth. The archaeological record often shows a clear pattern of technological regression after the Great Rupture. The pottery of the post-Diluvian era is frequently thicker, less refined than what came before. The architectural techniques are simpler, the scale of construction less ambitious for a time. It is the physical evidence of a loss of skill, a forgetting of a craft. The world after the restart was a cruder, more simplified version of the one that preceded it. It is the work of students trying to replicate the master's work from memory. The antagonist's victory is measured in this subtle but pervasive decline in quality, this slow degradation of the inherited design. Even the surviving records show signs of this degradation. When scholars compare the different fragmented copies of the king list, they find discrepancies. The reign of one king might be listed as 600 years in one version and 21, 0 in another. A name might be spelled differently. A whole city might be omitted from one list but present in another. These are not mere scribal errors. They are the symptoms of data corruption. They are evidence of a culture trying to reconstruct a single, authoritative master document from multiple, damaged, and incomplete sources. The antagonist is visible in the static, in the noise that crept into the signal as it was copied and recopied by generations of scribes who were moving further and further from the original source. The city of Eridu, named in the lists as the very first seat of kingship, stands as a perfect symbol of this sealed-off past. Archaeologically, it is one of the oldest settlements ever excavated in Mesopotamia. The layers of its occupation go down and down, deeper into time. But the lowest levels, the ones that would correspond to the arrival of the first kings, are now deep beneath the modern water table. They are physically inaccessible, drowned by the very element that is said to have caused the Great Rupture. The origin point of the entire system, the place the texts designate as the beginning, is sealed away from us by a literal flood. The antagonist has guarded the source code, burying it in a tomb of mud and water. This silence is also geographical. The foundational knowledge system we have been tracing, the shared memory of antediluvian rulers, a great cataclysm, and the transference of knowledge from non-human teachers, burns with incredible brightness in Sumer and Egypt. But its light barely seems to penetrate the surrounding lands. The contemporary cultures of the Zagros Mountains, of Anatolia, of the Levant, do not seem to share this specific, highly structured administrative memory. It is as if the knowledge was contained, quarantined. There are no clear records of its transmission, no missionary sages spreading the lexical lists to the barbarian world. This lack of echoes, this strange isolation of the core data, is another form of silence, a boundary around the known world that is as real as any mountain range. One begins to see the great works of the earliest age not as completed monuments, but as abandoned projects. The vast, flattened temple platforms, the impossibly precise astronomical alignments, the sheer scale of the initial earthworks, they feel like the foundations of something far grander that was never finished. They are the first phase of a global or regional construction project that was brought to a sudden and catastrophic halt. The antagonist is the force that pulled the funding, that fired the contractors, that left the job site to be slowly reclaimed by the desert. The ruins are not just the remains of a past civilization, but the evidence of a future that was cancelled. This context reframes the entire psychology of the scribe. His obsessive, repetitive cataloging of the world is not the confident work of a man at the dawn of a new age. It is the anxious, almost neurotic behavior of a survivor of a profound trauma. The endless lists are an attempt to impose order on a world that has fallen into chaos, to rebuild a mental library whose shelves have been shattered. The scribe is not a creator. He is a custodian of fragments, desperately trying to save the last few pages from the all-consuming silence. The invisible antagonist is the constant looming threat of another system crash, another total erasure of the world's memory. We look again at the astronomical tablets, but this time we see what is not there. The texts contain knowledge of celestial cycles, like the precession of the equinoxes, that require thousands of years of continuous, stable observation to discover. We have the results of this long science, the final tables and calculations, but we have none of the raw data. There are no records of the centuries of nightly observations, the failed hypotheses, the slow accumulation of knowledge that must have preceded the conclusion. We have been given the answer key, but the workbook, with all the meticulous calculations, has been destroyed. The antagonist has erased the scientific process, leaving only the miraculous-seeming result. And so, we are left in this archive, surrounded by a silence that is not empty but articulate. It speaks. It tells a story of a world that was broken. Every missing piece, every shattered tablet, every flooded ruin, every forgotten word is a testament to the power of the antagonist, the force of erasure that stands between our time and the time of the others. The true history of our world is not written in the lines of cuneiform on these clay shelves. It is written in the cracks between them. The silence is not an absence of information. It is the information itself. The pattern of this absence is too consistent to be accidental. A shared memory of a rupture, a technological regression, a sudden disappearance of the instructors, a frantic effort to preserve a corrupted data set. This is not the signature of slow decay. It is the signature of a singular, structured event. The silence that blankets the antediluvian world was not a gradual fading of the light. It was a switch being thrown. The loop of our investigation now turns inward, from the evidence of the erasure to the nature of the erasure itself. The question is no longer what was lost. The question is why. What was the silence designed to conceal? We have been following a trail of breadcrumbs, of broken clay and faded ink, leading us back through the dust to the very first entries in the world's ledger. We have seen the same anomaly, a history that begins before history, etched into stone in the Nile Valley and pressed into tablets on the plains of Sumer. We have observed the same administrative tone, the same obsession with lists and numbers, the same memory of a great, world-altering rupture. Seen in isolation, each of these records is a cultural curiosity, a mythological flourish. But when laid side by side in the quiet of this archive, they cease to be separate stories. They become a single, coherent signal, a message repeated in two different languages, broadcast from the ruins of a world we were never meant to forget. The signal does not speak of gods and magic. It speaks the cold, universal language of bureaucracy. It describes a transfer of power, a succession of governors, the implementation of a pre-existing order. The names may change, Anunnaki in one file, Shemsu-Hor in another, but the job titles remain hauntingly familiar. They are the founders, the legislators, the engineers, the instructors. The evidence, taken as a whole, does not point to a pantheon of deities. It points to an administration, a structured, hierarchical organization that managed this planet as a coherent enterprise long before the first human pharaoh or king was entered into the official record. The consistency of this memory is the foundation upon which the final and most profound implication is built. If these records are what they appear to be, the administrative logs of successor cultures, then civilization itself is not something humanity invented. It is something we inherited. The entire package, agriculture, urban planning, law, astronomy, writing, was not the product of a slow, stumbling evolution. It was a turnkey system, a technology transfer on a planetary scale. The first cities were not the result of trial and error. They were the implementation of a known architectural blueprint. The first laws were not born from social negotiation. They were the transcription of a pre-existing corporate charter. Our history does not begin with a creative spark, but with the quiet, diligent work of students copying the notes of a lesson they had already been taught. This single thought reconfigures the entire map of our past. We are not the authors of the story, but characters who entered in the second act. The world of the first scribes was not a blank slate, but a landscape already filled with the ruins and memories of a prior, and far more advanced, project. The earliest works of humanity are therefore not acts of discovery, but acts of recovery. The scribe, with his stylus and clay, was not exploring a new world. He was trying to draw a map of an old one from memory, desperately attempting to reconstruct a blueprint whose original architects had long since vanished. We have been reading our origin story as a book of Genesis, when all along it has been a survivor's manual. And the survival was not guaranteed. The system we inherited was broken. The rupture described in the texts and visible in the Earth's strata was not a simple interruption. It was a catastrophic system failure. The knowledge passed down was fragmented, the data corrupted. The work of the first civilizations was not just to rebuild, but to do so with an incomplete and damaged set of instructions. The obsessive, repetitive nature of their record-keeping is not the sign of a confident new beginning. It is the sign of a profound institutional anxiety, the behavior of a culture terrified of forgetting the little it still remembered, of losing the last connection to the world before the crash. This transforms the silence of the past from a passive void into an active presence. The missing records, the untranslatable words, the technological regressions, these are not accidents of time. They are the evidence of the event. They are the blast shadow of the rupture. Our entire recorded history, all 6,000 years of it, has been a long, slow process of trying to recover from this initial, catastrophic loss of information. We have been living in the shadow of a library that burned down before we were born, working from the few scorched pages that were pulled from the ashes. The antagonist was not a force of evil, but a force of entropy and erasure, and its victory was almost total. The implication, then, begins to expand beyond the simple question of our origins. It touches the very nature of our knowledge. If the foundational principles of our science and our society were part of this inherited package, to what extent have we been merely rediscovering fragments of a science that was once complete? The precession of the equinoxes, the complex mathematics, the sophisticated astronomical models, perhaps these are not the triumphs of our own intellect, but faint echoes of a system of knowledge so vast and ancient that its true source is now completely unrecognizable. We may be like children playing with the scattered components of a machine we have no hope of reassembling. What, then, was the purpose of the original project? The administrative records of the others are functional and dispassionate. They catalog the resources of this world, its minerals, its flora, its fauna, its astronomical alignments, with the detached precision of a surveyor. In these lists, humanity is often included, but not as the central focus. We are listed as another resource, another asset to be managed, another labor force to be organized. The chilling possibility arises that the entire project of civilization, as established by this prior administration, was never for our benefit. We were not the clients of the enterprise. We were part of the inventory. This thought hangs in the still air of the archive. The meticulous records of the scribe, the patient work of the archaeologist, the silent testimony of the stones, they all converge on this single, unnerving point. We have been proceeding under the assumption that history is our story. But what if it is not? What if we are simply the custodians of a failed colony, the inhabitants of an abandoned work site, left to make sense of the tools and the infrastructure that the original builders left behind. The scale of the mystery has now shifted from the history of a planet to the operational logs of an unknown and long-departed organization. Our sense of place in the cosmos is fundamentally destabilized. We are no longer the measure of all things, the pinnacle of a long, linear ascent from the mud. Instead, we become a secondary phenomenon, a consequence of a larger and now invisible drama. The great questions of our philosophy and our religion, where did we come from? Why are we here? Are reframed. They are no longer abstract, metaphysical inquiries. They are practical, almost forensic questions. We are asking about the mission parameters of a project that was abandoned millennia ago. We are sifting through the administrative debris for a clue to our own intended function. The path of this inquiry does not lead to a final answer, but to a deeper and more profound state of questioning. It is a vigil kept with the oldest fragments of our memory. For those who choose to remain on this watch, the journey forward is not about finding new data, but about learning to sit with the immense and structured silence of what is missing. It is an acknowledgement that the most important parts of our story may be precisely the ones we are unable to read. This is a commitment not to a conclusion, but to the integrity of the question itself. The lens of our investigation must now pull back, beyond the walls of this archive, beyond the ruins of Sumer and Egypt. The patterns we have observed suggest a level of planning and coordination that transcends any single human culture. We are not looking at the history of humanity. We are looking at the faint, residual evidence of a system that operated on a planetary scale. The project, whatever its ultimate purpose, was global in its scope. The rupture, whatever its cause, was global in its effect. The silence it left behind is the true shared heritage of all mankind. This leaves us with the unsettling realization that our entire civilization may be an artifact. Our languages, our myths, our sciences, our social structures. They may all be the complex, degraded echoes of a single, coherent system that was installed here in the deep past. We are not the builders of this world. We are its inheritors, and perhaps its squatters. The work of the scribe, the first act of our recorded history, was an attempt to read the fading letters on the building's original cornerstone, to remember the name of the architect and the intended purpose of the structure we now inhabit. The final implication is not historical, but existential. If our foundational software was written by another hand, for a purpose we do not know, then who are we? Are we the masters of our own destiny, or are we simply the ghosts in a machine that was built by someone else? The silence from the past is mirrored by a silence from the stars. We are surrounded by a vast and ancient quiet, and the oldest records we possess seem to be telling us that this quiet was once broken, that the universe was once a much more administrative place. The mystery that began with a single number on a clay tablet has now expanded to encompass the entire human condition. The question is no longer about kings who lived for 800 years. The question is whether our own brief and violent history is anything more than a long, painful reboot sequence. We are a culture with amnesia, standing in the ruins of a forgotten golden age, looking at the stars and wondering if our creators will ever return to finish the job. The single tablet in its glass case seems smaller now, a tiny, fragile data point in an ocean of overwhelming absence. Its message is not in the names or the numbers, but in the simple, desperate act of its own creation. It is a testament to the one impulse that survived the Great Rupture, the need to remember. It is a single, flickering lamp, held up against a darkness that is not empty, but full of the silent, structured memory of a world that we can no longer see, but whose shadow we have been living in for 6,000 years. The light in the archive has grown thin. The day outside has ended. The great hum of the city beyond these walls has softened to a distant, rhythmic pulse. Here, in the managed twilight, the work is done. The files are closed. The connections have been made. The pattern has been held up to the low lamp for a final, steady look. Now, all that remains is the slow, quiet act of withdrawal. The inquiry does not end with a conclusion, but with a retreat. It recedes, leaving the evidence to rest once more in its long and patient silence, just as it was found. The story does not belong to us. We were only its visitors. The eye is drawn back to the beginning, to the single piece of hardened earth that initiated this long watch. It rests on its velvet cushion, a fragment of a forgotten world's administrative mind. Its edges are still chipped, its surface is still a fine map of cracks and imperfections. But it is no longer just an object. It has become a vessel. It holds the weight of 200 years of unrecorded time, the echo of a flood that washed the world clean, and the faint, spectral signature of the hand that made the first entry. It does not offer up its secrets, it simply is. And its silent, stubborn existence is more profound than any answer it could ever contain. One can almost feel the presence of the scribe, not as a historical figure, but as a persistent human echo. A man in a reed-lit room, his back bent to his task. He was not thinking of us, of the distant future that would puzzle over his work. He was thinking only of the line, of the number, of the name. His task was not to explain, but to preserve. He was a link in a chain of memory, a single anonymous hand trying to hold back the encroaching silence. The sheer impossibility of the data he was transcribing seems to have been irrelevant. What mattered was the act of recording itself, a small, defiant gesture against the vast and totalizing force of what is forgotten. The silence in this room is now absolute. It is a presence, not an absence. It is the accumulated quiet of every century that has passed since the clay was still wet. It is the silence of the libraries that burned, of the languages that died, of the cities that were buried under the shifting sands. This room is a sanctuary built against that great silence, but it is also a monument to its victory. Every object on these shelves is a survivor, a refugee from a history that was almost completely erased. To stand here is to stand on the shore of an ocean of loss, holding the few beautiful, broken shells that have washed up at your feet. The question that began this journey has not been answered. It has only deepened, its roots reaching further into the dark soil of the past. Why would a civilization, at the very moment of its birth, anchor its identity in a history that defies all logic? The numbers themselves, the 28, 800 years, the 43, 200 years, have ceased to be the focus. They are merely the symptom, the strange, feverish data point that reveals the presence of a much larger, and now invisible, body of memory. The question is no longer about the length of a king's reign. It is about the nature of time itself, and the memory of a world that operated under a different clock. The single lamp that has illuminated our work now seems to cast a longer shadow. Its light does not conquer the darkness of the room. It only serves to define its edges, to show how vast it truly is. This is the nature of such an inquiry. It does not lead to a brightly lit chamber of answers, but to a deeper appreciation for the darkness that surrounds the small, fragile circle of what we know. The search for our origins is not a journey toward the dawn. It is a slow, patient descent into a dusk that fell long ago, a dusk from which our world has yet to fully emerge. The dust motes dance in the last beam of light, each one a tiny particle of the past. The dust of the desert, of ground-down pottery, of decayed papyrus, of human bone. It is the final, elemental state of all empires and all records. The antagonist, that great invisible force of erasure, is ultimately just this: the slow, inexorable return of all things to dust. The scribe's clay tablet is a temporary victory against this process, a brief stay of execution. But in the end, the wind and the sand will claim it too, and the silence will be complete once more. Beyond these walls, the world continues its frantic forward motion. Its memory is short, its gaze fixed on the immediate future. It has no time for the quiet contemplation of a cracked piece of clay. The concerns of the present are too loud, too demanding. But here, in this pocket of suspended time, the weight of the deep past is the only thing that feels real. The disconnect is absolute. It is the feeling of holding a fossil in your hand while standing in the middle of a roaring highway. The two realities do not touch. They exist in separate streams of time, and only here, in the quiet, can one feel the current of the older, slower river. The mind drifts from this room back to the source, to the desolate, wind-swept mounds of southern Iraq, where the city of Eridu lies sleeping under the dust of 6,000 years. The sun is setting, casting the broken lines of the ziggurat in sharp relief against a bruised purple sky. There are no voices here. There is no movement, save for the whisper of the wind through the dry reeds. This is the place the record calls the beginning, the first seat of kingship. But it feels like an ending. It feels like a graveyard, a monument to a story whose first and most important chapters were buried alive. The wind that blows across these ruins is the only thing that has been here from the start. It is the same wind that dried the scribe's clay, that carried the scent of the floodwaters, that heard the first decrees of the first kings. It speaks a language older than cuneiform, a language of pure elemental erosion. It is the breath of the antagonist, the patient, persistent sound of the world being slowly ground back into sand. It does not tell a story. It erases one. To listen to it is to feel the immense, geological scale of time against which our own brief history is nothing more than a fleeting inscription. As the last light bleeds from the horizon, the stars begin to appear. They are sharp and cold in the clear desert air, the same stars that the astronomers of Sumer and Akkad charted with such impossible precision. They are the fixed points, the constants in this story of rupture and loss. They watched the others arrive, they watched the cities rise, they watched the waters come, and they watched the survivors begin the slow work of remembering. They hold the memory of the full cycle, the complete pattern. But they do not speak. They are the silent, celestial archive, their records written in a light that takes eons to reach us. There is a feeling that settles upon a place like this at night, a sense of being a latecomer, an intruder in a house that has been empty for a very long time. The past is not dead here. It is just quiet. It watches from the shadows of the broken walls, from the dark spaces between the stars. It does not judge or welcome. It simply is. And in its immense, silent presence, our own questions, our own need for answers, seem small and unimportant. We are not here to solve its mystery. We are here to bear witness to the scale of its silence. The work of the narrator is finished. There are no more connections to draw, no more implications to unfold. The voice now falls silent, joining the quiet of the archive, the quiet of the ruin. The guide has led us to the threshold and can go no further. What remains is not a theory or a conclusion, but a feeling, a resonance, the sense that the world is far older and far stranger than our histories have ever allowed. The story is not over. It has simply been returned to its proper custodians, the dust, the wind, and the patient, silent stars. The ruin of the ziggurat stands as a stark silhouette against the deepening night, a man-made mountain of forgotten purpose, its edges softened by the erosion of 60 centuries. Above it, the great river of the Milky Way flows in its cosmic silence. Nothing moves. The air is still and cold. The world holds its breath. The image remains a final, silent testament, a broken staircase reaching for a sky full of silent witnesses. The question does not fade. It becomes part of the darkness, part of the landscape, waiting for the next dawn or the next flood.